Hello, Bible scholars. Happy Friday. Welcome back to Oops, It's a Bible Channel. Oops, because nothing says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel," quite like that does. I'm just your fellow student, Leah Nicole, and today we are going to talk about a problem that a lot of people have with Christianity. A lot of times I've heard this question brought up, and I've heard some good answers, but a lot of the times people just aren't prepared to answer this question. So, today I'm going to present kind of a bit of a long answer, but an answer to the question of, if God is all powerful and God is all loving and God is all knowing, why does suffering and struggle still happen anyways? And the shorter answer is, there's usually a reason for it. A lot of time, and we usually don't know what that reason is as we go through the struggle, but the struggle is usually for a reason. Now, I'm going to start with the answers that have to do with that person specifically. Then I'm going to go on to the ones that have to do more with the greater idea of God and His plan in general. So, starting off, I'm going to give a list of reasons and then a bunch of examples to kind of back it up. So the first reason, which probably should not be the reason that you necessarily go with at first, because they're not going to like this answer, but sometimes God uses suffering to discipline someone for a sin that they do. So Adam and Eve is the first example here. They were sent out of the Garden of Eden because of the sin they committed. The sin of going against God's word and choosing their own way instead. The next example we have of that is just the next generation. Cain. He was forced to wander the earth for a very, very long time because he killed his brother Abel. After that, there are the people who built the Tower of Babel. They were forced to spread out and go everywhere, and God confused their languages because they tried to build themselves up to God and try to bring themselves up to God's level or bring God's level down to them. Then you have Israel, God's people, who had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because they didn't trust God's plan for them, and they didn't trust that God would let them have the promised land. Then you have Jonah, who was sent into the stomach of a whale because he tried to run away from God and tried to go the opposite way of what God told him to do. Then a little later you have Israel again, who were allowed to be taken over by the Persians and the Babylonians because of their continued idolatry and continued turning away from God. A little bit later than that, you have King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of the Babylonians, who was struck with and given the mind of a beast, a literal animal, because of his pride and because he would not turn to God. Then, for the New Testament, you have Saul, who was later called Paul, who was blinded partly because of his persecution of the early Christians. Then a little later, you have Ananias and Sapphira, who were literally struck dead on the spot because they tried lying to God, which never works anyways. And then, of course, eventually, you have Satan will be punished forever for all of the things that he's done. But he's on a completely different level, I think. And then, to back this up, you have Hebrews 2, 5 through 11. If you'd like to read that, you can. Another reason is to help us and sharpen us and help us to have a better character, stronger faith, and all those kinds of things. One example is Joseph, who, at least it seems like he started off very bragging, hey, look at me, look at this awesome coat I have, and look at this dream, I'm so much better than you. But then, after he went through his slavery and jail time, he seems to be a lot more humble and say, no, it wasn't, I can't do this, but God can, through me. In fact, I don't even think he said through me, I think he just said God does it. And then later, of course, you also have Saul, who became Paul, literal name change because of him. Because of partly because of when he saw God and was blinded for that. So there were a few reasons for that one. But an even better argument for this are these two passages. You have James 1, 2 through 4, count it joy when you go through these things. And then Romans, suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character. So those, I think, are the best arguments for that. And then you also have the passage where Paul talks about how he went through trials and they thought they were going to die, but that was to kind of force them to rely on God. I'll put the reference here. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. Another reason is to test your own faith and sharpen your faith. So I guess it was kind of part of the produce character, but this is to test and show and prove your faith. So you have Abraham, of course, with him being forced to go find a land that he didn't know where it was. And then later, when he was told to sacrifice Isaac, those were both to test and prove Abraham's faith. And of course, God already knew that Abraham was faithful, but I believe that part of that was to show Abraham, I think. And then there's also the story of Job. It seems to be that part of that was to kind of prove to the adversary that Job wasn't going to curse God like he said he would, or like he thought he would. But we're going to get back to Job later, and that's going to be a completely separate point. So I'm not done with Job yet. But for this you also have 1 Peter 1 verses 6 and 7, which says that it will prove and refine your faith like gold. It goes through fire and the impurities get taken out, and suffering kind of does a similar thing with your faith. So those are 3 personal reasons why someone could be going through suffering. Now, you might not want necessarily to answer the questions in this way if someone is going through struggling. You might not want to tell them, oh, maybe it's because you did something wrong, which we'll talk about later when we talk about Job. Or you might not want to say, it's okay, this builds character, because nobody wants to hear that. Or, like, this is just testing your faith. Like, that's just kind of annoying, and it's probably not going to help very much. But what can help are some of these other things that I'm going to talk about later. Those first 3 there are to help you whenever you're going through something, partly as well. You can see these things, and you can then turn and use it to build your character and use it to sharpen your faith more easily. So, here's some other reasons why God might allow suffering in your life. So, another reason is just in general to do good through it. Sometimes, it doesn't feel like it, but sometimes when you go through suffering, it's so that somebody else can have something good happen to them. If you don't get something, then that means somebody else does have it. Like, if you don't get a job, that means somebody else is getting a job they didn't have before. So that's one way you can think of it. A couple of examples of this are Joseph, who was sold into slavery and then imprisoned for years, but through that, he was able to save a ton of people through God's dream that he gave to Pharaoh and through Joseph's thinking ahead and planning. Then you have Esther, who was forced into a position that she didn't want, forced to leave her home and live somewhere else, and also forced to risk her life to save her people from being killed by the people living there. And then you have the Apostle Paul, again, who was blinded, and then because of that encounter with Jesus, he does good, and he's done a lot of good. The best verse examples of this are Romans 8:28, for we know that in all things God will work through the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. You have Genesis 50 verse 20, where Joseph is telling his brothers, you meant this for evil, but God turned it to good. Another reason, which you might not necessarily want to use, is to show God's power, to show God's power, and a lot of times to kind of show us that we need to rely on him for things. So, as an example, you have Egypt. I would say they suffered a lot for the 10 plagues, and part of that was to show God's power to the Egyptians and show them that he is more powerful than the idols that they worship. And then you have Elijah, who was threatened to be killed and then was in the wilderness for 40 days. But through that was part of how he went up to Mount Carmel, and he called and God sent fire down when Elijah asked, and that was to show God's power. Another example of this, a very pretty much explicitly stated example of a reason for this, is the blind man in John chapter 9. Whenever his disciples see him and ask Jesus, did this guy sin or did his parents sin for him to become blind? And Jesus basically says neither. It's to show God's power, and then he heals him. And then future unbelievers in Revelation are definitely going to go through the trials, but part of that is going to be part of the discipline for sin, but part of that, I believe, is also going to be to show God's amazing power and wonder. A couple of examples of this is John 9 verse 3, which I just talked about whenever Jesus was like, this was to show God's power. And then 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9 is another Bible verse that helps solidify it. Another reason is to fulfill God's greater plan. God always has a plan for it. And sometimes the suffering is directly to make that happen. So, like I had said, Abraham, he was forced to wander around going, he didn't even know where, so that a promised land could be established for God's nation to live in, for Jesus to come through. Another example of that is Egypt again, where they also suffered through the 10 plagues so that the Israelites would leave Egypt and go back to their promised land. And then you have the suffering of Ruth and Naomi, who their suffering, they both lost their husbands and then had to travel to Israel. For Ruth, it was a country she had never been to and didn't know anybody. For Naomi, Naomi had lived there, but it was still difficult to try to travel all the way back. And she was in mourning because she had lost her husband and sons. But through that, God brought Boaz and Ruth together. And then through that line came the line of David, and then therefore the line of Jesus. So if we didn't have the story of Ruth and Naomi, we wouldn't have Jesus. And that's not the only application in the book of Ruth, of course, but that is one of them. And then, of course, very obviously, we have the sufferings of Jesus fulfilled God's plan to save us. Jesus hung and died on a cross to save us from our own sins, so that we didn't have to pay the punishment for that anymore. But he didn't stay dead. That's not the end of the story. 3 days after he died, he rose again out of the grave. He defeated death, and now we can have hope that we can return and be with him someday. That is the story of Jesus and how that fulfilled God's plan. If you want to know more about that specifically, I have a video right here. Then you also have the persecution of the early Christians, as described in Acts, where they were persecuted, but that sent them out of Israel and helped them spread the gospel all over the world, fulfilling God's plan. A verse for this is 1 Peter 4, verse 12. Another more practical reason that has to do directly with God is simply because people hate Jesus and hate God, and therefore hate the people who love and follow him. So you're going to face suffering simply because people hate God. Obviously, you have the early Christians, like I said, but more specifically, you have the apostles and you have the other martyrs who died for their faith. And then future Christians are also going to suffer and die for their faith because people hate Jesus. And this is explicitly stated in John 15, 18 through 19. And then he also says something similar in Matthew 5, verse 11. Okay, so I said I wasn't done with Job, but I haven't mentioned Job again. So this is what I'm talking about. So we have all of these reasons that could potentially be why someone is suffering. Obviously, it could be a multitude of those reasons, which is why quite a few of them got mentioned multiple times. But that shouldn't necessarily always be the first thing we think of whenever we're going through suffering is, why is this happening? So, the story of Job goes that Job was very, very, very rich, and he was a righteous man. He followed God. But all of his wealth got taken away, his sons got taken away, and his health got taken away. All of his possessions, the people he loved, his health, all got taken away from him. And it wasn't because he had sinned, because it was already said that he was a righteous man. So some of his friends come over and are like basically saying that Job must have done something wrong, to very, very, very basically say it. But the conversation is very, 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 very long. But at the end, Job basically is challenging God, saying, why did you do this? I want you to answer for this suffering. And so God does answer him, but not in the way Job is wanting him to. God says, were you there when I made creation? Were you there? Can you tame these creatures that will literally do anything I tell them to do without even thinking about it? Who only do exactly what I make them do? Can you do that? Did you, basically saying God is so much bigger and so much more powerful and so much more in control than we could possibly ever even come close to comprehending. So the idea that we think we have the right to demand an explanation from God as to why this happened is incredibly prideful, and that's not the attitude we need to have. So the attitude that we should have whenever we go through suffering is, God has a plan, God is in control, and we are not. So even if we don't know why we're suffering, God knows why, and that should be good enough for us. God is in control, and that should be good enough for us. Even if it doesn't get resolved in this life, if you trust God and trust in Jesus' sacrifice to save you from your sin, then all of those problems will go away whenever you're in heaven with him, of course. So this video was a bit of a heavy topic, really, but I hope that this can help you to answer when somebody is asking you about this, challenges this, if you're discussing Christianity with someone who's not a Christian, or if you are going through suffering, hopefully this can help you have the right mindset when you're going through this kind of thing. Like I said, the book of James says to count it joy when you go through suffering. And Paul multiple times talks about how he goes through suffering and he sees it as a win, essentially. So, when we go through suffering, we can know that this life is not important. Like, it's not that important, really, when it's compared to heaven and the things to come. There's a verse, I'll put the reference here, that explicitly says, "For I consider these present sufferings not fit to be compared with the glory that is to come." I'm paraphrasing, but it's something close to that. So again, this was a heavier video, but I really do hope it helps. And that is all I have for you for today. If you liked this video and it helped you and encouraged you some maybe, go ahead and click the like button. That way I know that it did and that I can make more videos like this. I can make maybe more heavy videos that deal with heavier topics. If you would like my videos in general and would like to see more of them, then go ahead and click. The best way that you can do that is to hit subscribe and click the notification bell. That way you are up to date on when I post videos, even if it's outside of my normal Friday. If you have questions about what I said, or if you have a point you'd like to make about this topic, or if you have a request for a video you'd like me to make in the future, go ahead and comment those so that I and others can see it. Also, especially for this video, because of the topic, if you have a prayer request that you would like people to pray for, that you're comfortable with other people saying, also you can comment that if you feel comfortable doing that. Now, of course, obviously you don't have to, but it'll be okay. That's all I have for you for today. God bless you all, and I will see you next Friday. Read your Bibles.